The Philippines is made up of over 7,000 islands, with a population of almost 80 million people. It has a tropical climate and is generally hot and humid all year round. Rainfall patterns vary across the different regions, but typically it is relatively dry from January to May, while typhoons prevail during the monsoon season between June and December. Much of the country is highly urbanised, with 43% of the people living in towns. Industry and services dominate the economy. Nevertheless, approximately 40% of the population currently lives below the poverty line, and this is increasing. An estimated 6 million Filipinos work in different countries around the world, and their remittances to their families make a significant contribution to the economy. One-third of the population makes their living from agriculture. Rice, coconut, sugar, coffee and tobacco are the major agricultural crops. In rural areas, the poverty rate is much higher, with 1 in 2 families living in poverty. Many settlers are farm workers who depend on seasonal crops such as sugar and coconut, which are grown in plantations or on haciendas. Although land reform programs are being implemented by the government, they are usually not accompanied by investment in infrastructure and credit facilities. The central group of islands of the Philippines is called the Visayas. Negros is one of the larger islands in the Visayas. Half of the country's sugar is produced here. During the Spanish colonial period, large haciendas were established throughout Negros, and wealthy families gained control over most of the land. Railways and sugar factories were built, and sugar became the major crop of the island. In 1875, almost the entire Negros Island was covered with tropical rainforest. By 1945, the forest had been considerably reduced, and by 1992, only a few patches of protected areas remained. Mount Canlaon is one of the 10 sites in the Philippines which has been protected through a World Bank-supported project. The major objective is to rehabilitate degraded areas and to restore their biodiversity. More than 3,000 households have settled within the park area and depend on the natural resources for their livelihood. The communities participate in the protection and conservation of the area. They are assisted by the Multi-Sectoral Alliance for Development, a non-government organisation in cooperation with the Department of Environment and Natural Resources. One major component of the project is to promote alternative enterprises and income sources for the settlers, in order to avoid destructive activities like charcoal burning, logging and honey hunting. Some community members from people's organizations of Negros had visited commercial beekeeping enterprises in other parts of the Philippines and came up with the idea to start beekeeping around Mount Canlaon. It was hoped beekeeping would help protect the environment while generating income through sales of honey and other bee products.
Yes, we're trying to make toothpaste, we're trying to make antibacterial...
Since Muad themselves lacked the know-how to teach beekeeping, the German Development Service was requested to provide technical expertise, and with funding from German Agro-Action, beekeeping was able to begin. Before establishing a beekeeping project in a developing country, there are many aspects to consider. The most important is to choose the right bee species. In the Philippines, 3 native honeybee species exist. Apis dorsata is the giant Asian honeybee and is known locally as putukan. The bees typically build one huge comb attached to a branch high up in the trees, which may reach 1 meter by 1 meter in size. They produce a large amount of honey. Traditional honey hunters climb the trees and collect this honey for sale. On most of the islands, the habitat for Apis dorsata has disappeared, and the bee can only be found in or near protected areas. This species of bee cannot be kept in beehives and is therefore not suitable for beekeeping. Apis florea is the dwarf Asian honeybee, but does not exist in the Philippines, but a very similar species, Apis andreniformis, is found exclusively on Palawan Island. The pictures here show Apis florea in Cambodia. The dwarf honeybee species do not generate much honey, hence there is little commercial interest from beekeepers. Apis cerana, locally known as liquan, is the only native Asian honeybee species which may be kept in beehives. However, it has become a rare species in the Philippines. On Negros Island, it is almost extinct. In the event that a swarm or colony of bees exists outside the protected areas, it is usually destroyed immediately, either by children or by people who steal the honey. There is no tradition of keeping Apis cerana in hives in the Philippines, as there is in other Asian countries. A few individuals have tried to catch bee colonies of Apis cerana from the wild. However, keeping them in hives for long periods has so far been without success. The much lower honey yield of these bees, of only 4 to 5 kilograms per year, is also not very attractive. It was for these reasons that the people were not interested in the native bee species and wanted to keep the European honeybee Apis mellifera, which promises a yield of 20 kilograms or more per hive. In fact, beekeeping with the western honeybee started in the Philippines in the 1970s with the importation of bee colonies from Europe and the introduction of the frame hive technology. This development was strongly supported by the government. At present, there are approximately 100 beekeepers in the country, with an estimated 3,800 bee colonies producing 76 tons of honey per year, an amount which is far less than the demand. There were very few beekeepers already existing on Negros Island, and none of them were able to supply a sufficient number of bee colonies for the start of the project. Finding carpenters who were able to manufacture hives in a short period of time proved to be difficult. Hence, there was no choice but to purchase beehives and nucleus colonies from Luzon, the northern part of the Philippines. The bees were transported by aeroplane, and the hives came by ship to Negros Island. The nucleus colonies were stored temporarily in a garden in Bacolod to relieve the stress of transportation and to give time to the beekeepers in the mountains for painting and protecting the hives against the elements.
So low. Help me believe what tomorrow would bring, but today doesn't really know.
Some equipment, like foundation sheets, smokers and hive tools, is available from local commercial manufacturers, though it is difficult for remote beekeepers to obtain such items, and they are also expensive. One foundation sheet can cost up to $1, and therefore the project purchased a hand press for the recycling of the old cones. Fortunately, protective clothes and even veils were not needed, because the bees were not at all aggressive. Later, when the beekeepers needed more hives, local carpenters manufactured them fairly accurately, including the frames. Meanwhile, 3 groups of interested participants around Mount Canlaon were preparing and establishing apiaries. When the bees arrived, the new beekeepers transferred the nucleus colonies to a larger beehive with greater enthusiasm.
Laki na, wala na boleh. Wala na boleh ya, laki na. Video na sa video na.
Subsequently, the new beekeepers all attended a 1-week introductory course in which they learned about the theoretical aspects of beekeeping. The emphasis, however, was on the practical handling of the bees and the demonstration of practical bee management methods.
4. Five.
Hindi siya advisable na every
Kada check.
ang checking bala hindi siya
The beekeeping training continued with regular visits of all groups providing training for beekeeping management in the different seasons. Let's start with December, when the monsoon slowly comes to an end and the first plants start flowering. The beekeeper notices an increasing activity of the bees and should check the colony regularly to add new frames for expansion. If not, bees may build the combs to the lid, which makes it impossible to manage the hive, and these combs are lost. If early drones are required for queen rearing, their frames should be inserted in a rapidly expanding colony in order to induce cell making for drones. Bees will build new combs and also the larger drone brood cells only in times of good food supply and expansion. Usually in March, when the flowers are in full bloom and all the frames in the brood chamber are drawn out, sufficient space for the bees' expansion has to be provided. A second, empty chamber is put next to the hive which is too crowded with bees. The search for the queen can now start. Once she is found, she must be separated, either in a cage or at a frame which is put aside, so that the beekeeper knows where she is. The beekeeper can now move 1 or 2 frames containing the sealed brood to the empty chamber and fill the gaps with new foundation frames. In the chamber with the 2 brood frames, the remaining empty space should also be filled with new frames. It is very important for the beekeeper to plan in advance and have sufficient frames with fresh foundation sheets prepared. The queen may now be placed back into the brood chamber, which is covered by a queen excluder. The chamber with the 2 brood frames, which is now called the super, is put on top and the 2-story hive is closed. The bees will immediately start to draw out the new frames. Space is provided and swarming prevented. In the super, the brood will soon hatch and the then empty cells are ready to be filled with pure honey, because the queen has no access to the super and cannot lay eggs in the now empty cells. This procedure may be repeated if the queen needs more space for laying eggs until the honey flow comes to an end. It may happen that the beekeeper has overlooked the signs of intended swarming and the bees have already made queen cells. In order to prevent swarming and to avoid the loss of the colony, immediate action is required. Every frame has to be checked and all queen cells have to be removed. The queen cells may be used in other queenless hives or for expanding the number of colonies. It is not ideal to use emergency or swarm cells, but in the Philippines, with a permanent shortage of queens, it can save some colonies. We now remove the colony from the bottom board and set it aside. A new box with empty frames is put on the bottom board. We will move only 1 brood frame from the former brood chamber, together with the queen and bees, into the centre of the empty chamber and fill the remaining space completely with new frames and foundation. This chamber now becomes our new brood chamber, which will be covered by a queen excluder. The box previously set aside, together with all other frames and bees, but without the queen, is put on top. We have created a new brood nest, and many bees will now rush into it for comb building and forget about swarming. The queen will soon lay eggs into the newly drawn out cells, while the hatching bees at the top leave empty cells, which will be filled with honey. It is advisable to feed the bees for a short period to induce comb building. In April, at the peak of the flowering season, the main honey flow starts. The fresh nectar is ripened by the bees in the comb cells and sealed with a wax layer. This is the time for harvesting, which will be shown later in this video. Immediately after the harvest, the most important management from Apis mellifera is to combat the varroa mite. How we try to control varroa will be shown when we talk about pests and diseases. In May, the flowering of bee plants comes to an end. The first rain showers occur and the queen reduces egg laying considerably. Very rapidly, the bees deplete the remaining food stocks, and if no food is provided, they will soon starve. Feeding throughout the monsoon season is therefore the major assignment for the beekeeper. White sugar and water are mixed half and half, and care has to be taken to ensure that the bees do not drown. During spells of good weather, where the bees may find some additional food, feeding can be suspended. At the end of May, the bees in the hive have become much fewer, and the struggle for survival starts under the adverse monsoon conditions. Disease breaks out, the colony gets too small and too weak, resulting in the bees' attempt to replace the queen by rearing a new one. This is called supersedure and happens, often unnoticed by the beekeeper, when the queen becomes too old or is not performing well. Usually, one or only a few large queen cells are built by the bees at the side edges or at the centre of the comb. After hatching, the queen has to be mated. However, if this happens during the monsoon, where no drones are available to mate the virgin, the colony will soon perish. The fortunate beekeeper will have discovered this disaster in time and will still have queens in reserve, which he can introduce to the colony. If open cells have been discovered, all virgin queens should be found and removed. Second, all queen cells have to be removed, and an egg-laying queen must be introduced in a cage. If not, she is likely to be killed. Some workers must accompany the queen from their origin. The cage can either be closed with sugar candy, or the queen has to be released after 3 to 5 days, which is the safer method. However, it may still be dangerous for the queen. If the clinging bees are shaken from the cage and rush immediately back and stick to the cage in excitement, it is too early to release the queen. If no queen is available, the queenless colony may be unified with a hive which has a queen. The newspaper method guarantees smooth unification without fighting among the bees. A newspaper sheet is placed between the two colonies, and some small holes can be punched in the paper to allow the bees to smell each other. The two colonies, of which one is queenless, are now put on top of each other. During the next few days, they will tear the paper down and unite peacefully. Sometimes a queen gets lost, which may happen at any time in the year. She may be killed by intruders, or even by her own bees, or accidentally by the beekeeper. In this case, the bees will immediately start searching for cells with recently laid eggs, from which they are able to rear new queens. Their usual smaller size, larger number, and their position, generally on the surface of the comb, easily identify emergency cells. There is no problem if drones are available, but if this happens during the off-season, or if a queen is not returning from the mating flight, or mating has failed, the colony is lost if the beekeeper cannot provide another queen. If all this has happened some time ago and remains unnoticed, as the bees have no laying queen, some workers will gain the capability to lay eggs. These eggs are, however, unfertilized, and only drones will hatch from them. The first sign is that many cells have more than one single egg. Drone cells appear irregularly and are easily identified by their dome shape. Later, the hive gets crowded with drones, the bees get distressed, and the hive collapses. At such a late stage, every attempt to save the colony is fruitless. During the remaining monsoon, old and unused combs should be removed from the hive and processed into beeswax. This is the time for repairs and maintenance of equipment. Depending on the weather conditions and the flight of the bees, the experienced beekeeper will know when to open for an inspection. Learning to read the signs of a queenless colony or an outbreak of disease will take some years of experience and observation. Hence, the training input in a beekeeping project is very high, and the minimum duration of such a project should be 3 to 5 years.
Sa dira, di ba? Kina halos nakabuto na tanan ang dason nga frame. So ini siya laban sirado. Amo ni siya ang ginatawag na cell brood. Ini siya pwede naton magamit, i-impon naton dito sa piyak. Pukinahanglan ang aton nga i-impon ang cell brood lang wise.
At first, beekeepers had to learn to understand the connection between the environment and the development of the bees in the hive and the honey yield. Groups of participants walked through farmlands in different directions in order to identify and register known bee plants and their flowering times. A flowering calendar should help to find promising apiary locations. Unfortunately, most typical small farms on Negros Island do not really provide good and sufficient bee forage. In the uplands, where the small farms are situated, trees are scattered and agricultural crops like rice or sugarcane do not offer anything to the bees. Considering the short flight range of bees, there is hardly any location providing nectar and pollen in abundance. Crops like coconut, cashew, coffee and mango, which have the reputation of being good bee forage plants, were tested extensively over several flowering seasons, unfortunately with disappointing results. Upland conditions, it seems, are distinct from plantations in lowlands. Colonies which were placed close to rainforest never expanded sufficiently and were even starving throughout the summer. After testing many locations, the beekeepers came to the following conclusions. The bee forage in villages and gardens is best. It is average, but sometimes insufficient in small upland farms. And there is negligible bee forage near tropical rainforest. The summer season, from February to April, is too short to allow the bee colonies to build up sufficient strength for a good honey crop. During the long rainy season from May, sometimes to January, hardly any plants are flowering, and the high air humidity makes life for bees very difficult. They cannot survive the monsoon season without excessive feeding. Feeding sugar solution may save the bees from starvation and dying, but it is expensive. Lack of pollen prevents the queen from laying eggs. The colonies get smaller and smaller, and the handful of remaining bees will often not survive the stress and impact of the monsoon. Pollen feeding was tried, but any pollen or pollen substitute became mouldy the same day because of the high air moisture. The beekeepers were looking for alternatives and considered planting bee forage plants, such as fast-growing weeds like Amelda or Cadena de Amor. However, it is common knowledge that growing plants for bee forage is not profitable unless there are additional returns like fruits or timber. This is a long-term approach, and fruit tree growing has been part of the project activities. Another alternative was to try out migratory beekeeping, particularly during the monsoon season. It was discovered that bee colonies in gardens in Bacolod survived much better than in the uplands. Consequently, The beekeepers suggested moving some hives into gardens of a small town. Still, the result was a failure. Migratory beekeeping is, in fact, a highly advanced business which requires extensive planning, timing and knowledge, particularly if pollination services are to be offered. This lies beyond the capacity of small, poor beekeepers. Training in beekeeping must be very intensive and comprise all related topics such as bee biology, bee behaviour and the more practical handling of bees. It includes ecology and bee forage, as well as the harvesting, processing and marketing of honey and other bee products. Finally, equipment maintenance and calculation of financial viability and profits from beekeeping must also be part of the training. As mentioned earlier, all new beekeepers attended a 1-week beginner's course. After that, each group of approximately 20 people kept 8 beehives and learned the management of bees with regular visits from the NGO support beekeeping team. However, few members were present at each meeting, and it soon became clear that most participants would not gain sufficient experience and skills to manage bees successfully. It was therefore decided that each group should select 2 members who should be present during all team visits and take on the role of future trainers.
Una, imo ini siya, mas maayos sa dira, hindi ba? Halos nakabuto na tanan.
They visited beekeepers on other islands and attended the Philippines annual Beekeepers Association conference.
Hello! Hi! Party list? No! Ganyan yung kampanya ko sa party list namin natalo eh.
And in the Philippines, we have at least three species. The Apis cerana or the Laywan, the Apis dorsata, and lately we found one species, Apis underniformis, which is found only in the island of Palawan.
I have 271 colonies as of December. Kung sa karon mga 70 na zero, naman 201.
The trainers are now able to assist the beekeepers and shall continue to train new participants. They have also learned queen rearing over 3 summer seasons. This shall guarantee the continuation of beekeeping after the end of donor support.